Are we rolling?
Actually, no.
What's up, guys? We're Lizzie and Mike, and we have been married for 10 years. We've got 2 kids, and we moved to upstate New York in October of 2019.
Everyone's got to start with the first project, and this is ours. We want to walk you through everything that we learned on the way to building our very first cabin. We're looking at a 384 square foot cabin with a simple shed roof, and we really designed this cabin to be as efficient as possible from a space planning perspective and a cost perspective. So what really drove the size of the cabin was really based on the sizes of dimensional lumber that we could get from kind of any home supply store and lumber yard. So the whole cabin actually sits on 2 24-foot beams. And those are the largest beams that we could get, from our lumber yard. So that really just defined everything about the shape and footprint of this particular structure. From varying angles, the cabin may appear to almost have a flat roof, but it's actually a shed roof. There's a slight slope, and a shed roof really is a roof style that just has one high side and one low side, and it's just a simple slope, right? And we chose that roof style because the roof has a functional purpose, beyond just kind of cladding the structure, right? It actually, on the low side, there's a gutter system that collects all of the water that goes into our cistern, and we have a 1,000-gallon cistern that sits next to the cabin, and that's really the main water source for the cabin, right? The only water source. So we have an off-grid water catchment and storage system. When we started building this cabin, right, we wanted to make sure that it felt like the cabin was in nature, right? We, for this project, we didn't want to have a lawn, right? We didn't have to mow anything. So as you can see, the cabin is as close to nature as possible, right? I can barely kind of fit my arm actually in between this tree and the side of the cabin. And if you look up here, right, the canopy of the tree actually extends over the cabin itself, right? So that really kind of helps us feel really engaged with nature, right? It helps us feel good about the fact that we didn't have to cut too much down, to ultimately build this cabin. This is a pier-based foundation system, right? And this pier goes deep into the ground below the frost line, and there's several of these piers on the underside of this cabin, and this really kind of supports the cabin, ensures that it stays level and doesn't shift as the seasons change and the years go by. And then this huge beam, right, is essentially what the cabin is sitting on, right? There's 2 of them that run the length of the cabin, and then all of the additional framing, right? Right here is the floor assembly, right, with 2x12s, and then those are going perpendicular to this big beam. So everything is really just sitting directly on this beam, and then directly on these footings, and then these footings are driven several feet into the ground to ensure that the cabin stays stable over time. We're using 2x12s in the floor assembly, 2x6s in the walls, and 2x12s in the roof, right? And that enables us to have cavities, in the floor, wall, and roof, for the right amount of insulation, so that we can run electrical and plumbing lines. We used this Scandinavian type finish on the surface, which is actually a mix of pine tar and linseed oil. It's just simple pine boards, right? Finished with this material to get us this really kind of matte look, right? That still kind of exposes some of the character of the wood.
Let's take a look at the utilities.
This is our little mechanical corner. This big black tank right, is 1,000 gallons of water.
Where does that water come from?
This water comes, well, it technically comes from the sky. So this 1,000-gallon cistern, right, is fed from all of the rain that actually hits the roof of the cabin. It falls down the slope of the cabin into a hidden gutter that's built into the cabin itself, down the gutter downspout, and directly into this tank. It's actually filtered 4 times before it leaves a faucet or the shower head inside of the cabin. Based on how much water is in here, right? Like we can take a near 24-hour shower, like hot shower continuously, right? Like you would be like, yeah, I mean, like we could just shower for an entire day.
Again, we would never do that, but that just gives you a sense of really how much water fits into this big ass tank.
Yeah, so this is really like the chimney assembly, right? And on the inside of the cabin, you know, we have a really beautiful stove by a company called Morso. And we picked that stove because it has the smallest like back clearance to a combustible surface that you can buy like anywhere in the United States, right? So like we can hug the stove like all the way up, you know, against the wall. And like when you're dealing with a small space, you have to like really account for every inch, right? So like we didn't want to have a huge wood stove like protruding out into the room. So it was really important for us, you know, to use that space efficiently. And I remember, you know, like installing this chimney, you know, I was kind of like wrestling with like how far the chimney would be out, how far the stove would be out, and like finally got that like happy medium. And, you know, as I installed this, right, like I just kind of hit one of those like magic moments where like you're just kind of pushing everything together and it just like magically kind of locks into place, like not even a millimeter off. And I was just like, ah! So I went to my neighbor and I was like, hey Tim, like I don't have a ladder. Can I borrow one? And he's like, yeah, Mike. He's like, take this one. He's like, but be careful because it's kind of rickety, right? So I get back up here, put the ladder up, and I'm like halfway up the ladder, right? And I finally understand like what my neighbor means by like a little rickety, right? Because as I'm halfway up the ladder, the entire ladder just like collapses onto itself. Luckily, like my thumbs weren't like in the ladder because I would have easily just like broken my thumbs, snapped them clean off.
Wouldn't recommend coming on site and tackling any major projects with dangerous equipment while you're by yourself.
We chose this particular brand, Mr. Cool, because they have a product called, it's like a DIY style like air conditioner where the lines actually come pre-charged with like all of the coolant. Right? So, you know, I installed this myself. Like we routed it like through the walls and on the underside of the cabin, you know, pretty easily. You know, I just followed the instruction manual and kind of attached the coolant lines. And
this is not an ad for Mr. Cool.
Yeah, this is not an ad.
We actually just really like our Mr. Cool.
Yeah, that's plugged in over here. And that both cools and heats the cabin, you know, really, really efficiently.
This is our first build. This is the first cabin that we ever put up. And we started with the small footprint sort of starter house, because obviously we've got this big clearing right here that maybe someday we can build a larger home on. We came back in like 3 months' time, all of these grasses would be waist high and just full of bugs and birds and probably other little creatures that I don't know about. This A-frame, we'll talk about that another time, but this is actually a kit product that we designed and put together right here because it's got such a gorgeous view of the Catskill Mountains behind it. We let friends and family stay in there when they're visiting us at the cabin.
We couldn't find a plan online that we really liked, something that was like modern, compact, you know, also made sense for us and the child that we were about to have. So like we just designed it. You know, once we got to a concept that like felt just right, we actually hired an engineer and a draftsman to turn that design that just lived as like a 3D model on our computer into like a full set of construction drawing. Code compliant in every way, you know, something that was gonna like withstand the test of time, be able to turn back like, you know, gale force winds, you know, 100-year storm, right? Like making sure that we had something that was like truly gonna be solid.
Then we had to figure out how to pay for it.
Exactly, right? Not only did we have to figure out how to pay for it, we had to figure out like the exact materials that were gonna go in it.
Sometimes say that your inspiration for like the design and our sort of vibe and vision is like based on a couple different types of architecture, like Scandinavian, Japanese,
well, I think
California.
I think like, you know, I've spent a really, really long time like trying to understand, you know, architecture and aesthetics and, you know, how something can be built. And I think our travels across the globe have really gone on to inform, you know, like what our perspective is today. Like that's our style, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So really like this cabin reflects like all of those kind of different elements coming together in something new that's like wholly our own.
Totally.
Yeah. Thanks for taking a look at the first project that we ever built. This project happened way before we ever decided to start a company called Den. And you know what? This project ultimately went on to inform all of our designs, all of our customer builds, right? And where we are today. And today, we have like over 10 designs in our catalog, ranging from A-frames to traditional gable roof structures. And we've got hundreds of builds happening nationwide.
This is too promotional. We can't use that.